to give an opportunity, an opportunity to step back, to think about what it is that your students are reading and to prep that text. Now, I know that many of us have programs and curricula that we work from, but at the same time, it is what we know, the text, that allows for us to be most effective. When we know more, we do better, right? So this is an organizer to scaffold instruction. It can be used in a flexible way. You'll note that on the left-hand side, there's a focus on getting ready for instruction, thinking about the big ideas, what we want our students to take away from their reading, the development of literacy skills, as well as content goals, all right? And then as our students read, to be certain that they have the vocabulary, the language structures, including sentence comprehension, the knowledge, including text structure. Yes, that's a specialized type of background knowledge, the background knowledge, so that they can respond at different levels of understanding, including inferential levels, and so they can express that understanding. The right-hand side of the blueprint includes a series of questions that are based on what the researchers have told us, what the experts in the field have told us we should be thinking about as we design instruction for those particular contributors to comprehension. And of course, our focus today will be text reading. Notice that each of them, each of those sections contain questions, which prompts us to be metacognitive about our practice. So that's basically what the blueprint is. And of course, the focus for today will be the vocabulary section of the blueprint, a critical contributor to comprehension. I wanted to make this session as interactive as possible for you, so we've provided you with a participation guide. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to download that. We'll also be using a Jamboard, hence the stickies that you see over here, right? A Padlet at some point. And then of course you can use your keyboard. Cami will be monitoring the chat, any questions that you have as well as comments, and you can raise your hand as well. And then you have the PowerPoint handout that possibly can be used as a note-taking guide as well. So please be thinking about what it is that I'm conveying to you today. Be thinking about how it affirms what you already know. Be ready to acknowledge perhaps you need to change a little bit, and then to take some action. Each and every one of us comes to an experience like this with a great deal of knowledge, and I want to honor that. I also want to be certain that we all step back and think a bit about what else could we be doing that would make our instruction more effective for all of our students, but particularly those that are struggling. So when we think about the varied texts that our students are encountering in classrooms today across grade level, we may be thinking about texts or stories that are part whether narrative, shouldn't say stories, I should say excerpts, whether narrative or informational text that are included within the curriculum, or if we have the opportunity to choose text for our students to listen to or to read with us or independently, we should be thinking about what do they need to know and be able to do when they come to those texts in order to make meaning, in order to dig deeply into the meaning that's conveyed by the words within the text, right? And then secondly, what does that mean in terms of what we have to know and be able to do in supporting their ability to read a text like the founding of a democracy, perhaps used around 6th or 7th grade, or a story such as Tuck Everlasting, perhaps a 5th grade reading, or the story of Ruby Bridges, perhaps something that we're reading around 3rd grade, or Is the Earth Getting Warmer, perhaps a 7th grade text, or The Mystery of the Mummy around 4th grade, and so on. So as we think about these varied texts, and whether they're narrative or informational, students are coming to, and that we're working with them in order for them to arrive at a deeper understanding, we always have to be thinking about, do they have the vocabulary? Do they understand the sentences? Do they have the background knowledge? At what level of understanding can they express, right, what it is that they're taking away from the reading? And what does that mean in terms of our responsibility? Their right to learn how to read, our responsibility to teach them. And we, in this instance, have to particularly be thinking about that as it has to do with vocabulary. So, one of the things that I thought we could begin with was a surfacing of our knowledge, a bit of a quick self assessment related to vocabulary. And this is based on the International Dyslexia Association's Knowledge and Practice Standards, which, of course, was developed for all teachers of reading, right? And in this case, relates directly to vocabulary. By the way, the standards are reflective of the science of reading. So in your guide, your participatory guide, you have, all right, here it is. You have this particular self-assessment, and I've used emojis to reflect your response, yes, maybe, or no. So I know and understand the role of vocabulary or semantics in developing proficient reading. What would your response be? Yes, maybe, no. So take a moment. We're just going to take maybe 10 or 15 seconds for you to quickly read through this and respond to it. So again, you should be using your participation guide. All right. So now let's take a look at what we will be talking about specifically today. And this relates directly to those questions that you just responded to. So we'll begin with what evidence supports the vocabulary comprehension connection? In other words, what does it do with skilled reading and reading comprehension? And then secondly, how can we define and describe vocabulary? What comes to mind when we hear the word vocabulary? Thirdly, what does it mean to know a word, to truly know a word? Is it just the definition or is it more? And then what are the components of an informed instructional framework that's based in what we have learned about reading proficiency? Of course, as I was talking about reading proficiency, I can't imagine those of you who are familiar with the reading rope that didn't come to mind. And this is one way for us to be thinking about what reading actually is. And of course, this is Hollis Scarborough's visual metaphor that she developed for parents and educators initially to reflect and explain the complexity of reading. So what is skilled reading? It's the fluent execution and coordination of word recognition and text comprehension. What does it take over time for us to become skilled readers? Well, of course, we have to acquire word recognition skills. So we see a bundle with strands that represent the various contributors to word recognition at the bottom of the reading rope. At the top of the reading rope, we see those strands or contributors that directly contribute to language comprehension. The ability to do what? To access and use our background knowledge, to access and use our knowledge of word meaning, a breadth of meaning, a precision of meaning, our ability to use language structures, which include semantics and syntax, syntax being a vehicle for conveying word meaning, sentence comprehension, verbal reasoning, our ability to go below the surface of the text to make sense of meaning that's underlying the words the author has provided, and of course, our literacy knowledge, our knowledge of text structures. We know that all the strands of the rope are necessary, that they're interdependent, and that as they're woven together, we become more competent in terms of our reading. We also know that if any of the strands are frayed, then skilled reading is in jeopardy. And of course, we're focused today on vocabulary, that strand. So what's the connection? All right, an important contributor to overall skilled reading. What else have we learned about the importance of vocabulary? I think this first one's rather surprising if you haven't seen it before. Adequate reading comprehension depends on a person already knowing between 90 and 95% of the words in a text. Not just the ability to read the words, but to have some sense of the meaning of the words. And then Perfetti and Adloff telling us that successful comprehension depends upon accessing well-specified and a flexible knowledge of word form, the reading of the word, as well as its meaning. This ability to immediately access clear and crisp representation of word form along with meaning. And then, of course, Kate Kane telling us that children, and this, we know this, children with better vocabulary knowledge, right, are going to have better reading comprehension scores. So again, that question of, do we really understand and do we know, do we make this connection between vocabulary and reading comprehension and its importance? And then lastly, you Katz and colleagues pointing out to us the fact that vocabulary has predictive power. As early as kindergarten, language measures, including those of vocabulary, add to the prediction of reading comprehension difficulty over time, above and beyond other word reading predictors. This has an important implication that we should be screening for vocabulary at an early age in order to understand or to identify those children who potentially may have difficulty with making meaning of text. All right. So that was the first question, and it had to do with your response. Yes, no, maybe. Understanding that connection between skilled reading and reading comprehension. So now let's move to how can we define and describe vocabulary? And here we're going to ask you to use the link that Cami is putting in the chat box for you. It's a link to a Jamboard, all right? And the prompt here is vocabulary is. So I just want you to think about just a few words that come to mind when you think about what is vocabulary? Vocabulary is. And let's see if I can't go to the Jamboard itself, and then let's see if you can begin to populate for us. So vocabulary. So using the stickies, if you've used the Jamboard before, but I'm guessing you're all far more facile than I am with these tools, particularly after the last year that we've just had. But going to the side and using the sticky note, clicking on the sticky note, and then just a few words. Wow. So someone's got breadth and depth. Nice going. All right. Context. Yep. Words in context. Yeah. Common, academic, specialized. Beautiful. Okay. I can see this is a knowledgeable group. Expansive. Context clues. And you're all really fast at doing this. Okay. Content vocabulary. Yes. Vocabulary is the context of the word. Academic words. Yeah. The connection to knowledge. Absolutely. Words needed to communicate. All right. We'll just do this for another maybe 10 or 15 seconds. But very, very nice. Vocabulary is understanding the meaning and usage of words, including multiple meaning. Thank you. All right. Understanding. Yeah. Tools to share ideas. Tiers. All right. Okay. And words have multiple meanings. Wonderful. Yeah. Okay. So these are excellent, excellent responses. And so they aligned really with everything I'm about to share with you now in terms of my thinking on vocabulary. All right, so let's go back to the PowerPoint. And when I think about vocabulary, I think of a mental dictionary. So I think that our lexicon or a mental dictionary certainly is made up of meanings, all right, more than definitions, and we'll talk some more about that, and you've already somewhat expressed that in your responses. But we use our mental dictionary, we use our vocabulary for multiple purposes. So we can talk about receptive vocabulary, and we can talk about expressive vocabulary. If we're talking about receptive vocabulary, we're talking about being able to come up with the meaning of a word within text, for instance, for reading, as well as within the context of listening. Right? If we're talking about expressive vocabulary, we're talking about the words that we choose for writing, right? And the words that we choose for speaking. And one of the things we learned over time, certainly, is that our receptive vocabulary tends to be larger than our expressive vocabulary. That's because words within text and words within speech, connected speech, have a context, and that context allows for us sometimes to infer meaning as well. I think it's important for us to be thinking about the development of expressive vocabulary because this has everything to do with a depth of understanding. And someone mentioned breadth versus depth a few moments ago, right? Also, when we think about vocabulary, we might be thinking about all the words used to communicate thought. And again, someone expressed that on the sticky, words connecting to knowledge, to understanding all of the words that we have available to us to communicate our thoughts. We also can think of it as a critical focus for instruction. And oftentimes, when we think about instructional components, we think of vocabulary. Now, while we may treat that as a separate instructional component, I just want to remind everyone that that needs to be integrated with all the other levels of language processing that are necessary to make meaning. And that vocabulary instruction needs to be contextualized, right? And then the kinds of words that students must know to read increasingly demanding text. And again, some of you expressed content area words, but you also expressed academic words. And we know that academic vocabulary tends to be more sophisticated than the basic everyday words, perhaps the Anglo-Saxon layer of the language. These tend to be these are words that are based in our Latin layer of our language, in Romance languages, and in Greek, for instance, right? Here's yet another way to think about vocabulary, and I'm just going to give you a moment to read to yourself the words of Marilyn Adams. And I think someone, again, on the stickies, captured this. What makes vocabulary valuable and important is not the words themselves as much as the understandings they afford. Right. So when we think about vocabulary, we can think about word meaning kind of nested within knowledge itself and connected then certainly to other words and concepts. All right. So that second question, how can we define and describe vocabulary? I think we've addressed that. We now can talk a little bit about what does it mean to know a word. So when we think about acquiring word meaning, we need to be thinking about the fact that we acquire word meaning over time through instruction and through experience, through both oral and written experiences, right? And someone mentioned breadth and depth before, and in a moment we're going to talk more about that. What are the meanings of this? What does it mean to have a breadth of vocabulary? What does it mean to have depth in terms of vocabulary? How does that term fluency connect to vocabulary acquisition? Well, one of the things that we know is that we learn word meanings bit by bit, right? Our knowledge of a word when we're very, very little, such as dog, totally increases as we have more experience with a dog, right? Oftentimes, young children will fast map the meaning of words. And we see this when there's that word explosion that occurs between 18 and 24 months, where it seems like they can't get enough words. But unless they slow map or have, again, these experiences with words, right, they won't hold on to the words, nor will their knowledge of the word broaden. We also know that our knowledge of words are interrelated, that just as someone said a few moments ago, these words are connected to understanding, words are connected to knowledge networks, right? And oftentimes those knowledge networks are semantically related. And so when you begin to think about the use of semantic maps, for instance, you're tapping into the relationships that words have to one another, right? Synonyms, antonyms, for instance, gradation of meaning. And we also can talk about the multidimensional aspect of words, right? And when we think about this, we're thinking about the fact that it's not just about a definition. It's about meaning, but also it's about understanding meaning within a particular context. The multiple meanings, for instance, is about connotation, the emotions or the feelings or the characteristics that we attribute to a particular word. It's about the fact that words have their own phonology, their own orthography, right, as well as their meaning. And when we lay down a representation of a word, oftentimes we're connecting that phonology, orthography, and meaning, the semantics, right? In fact, we talk about the fact, and I alluded to this a few moments ago with Perfetti's quote, that when we have these very well specified representations of words, we can access both their form, the ability to read, as well as their meaning. So why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because as we think about instruction, one of the things we need to be thinking about is, are we developing words that our students are able to use expressively? Are we developing word meanings for depth, all right? In order to have a deep understanding of word over time, we need to understand these relationships. We need to understand the varied dimension of words. Oops, so we don't need this one. Okay, so let's just very quickly then check level of understanding, because someone brought up breadth, depth before. And you have within your participatory guide, again, you have this chart, and you just might want to check off for yourself, do I recognize these words as they relate to vocabulary? Do I understand the meaning? Do I understand in terms of what does it mean, breadth of vocabulary, depth of vocabulary, or fluency? And oftentimes we think about asking our students to tell us their levels of understanding about a word. And one way of thinking about this is, I have no understanding. I have a little bit of understanding, or I really understand this word. I like to put it in this language. I've never met this word. It doesn't live in my neighborhood. All right. I don't understand it at all in terms of vocabulary. Right. I've met this word, seen them around from time to time. All right. I have some sense of it, or I am BFF with this particular word. So just do a quick self-assessment. All right. So now stay with your facilitator guide, or you can use the screen if you'd like, and do a quick read, all right? And just check out whether or not you were on target in terms of your self-assessment. I'll give you about 30 seconds to do this. All right. So breadth has everything to do with how many words you recognize. You don't necessarily own these words. You're not necessarily BFF with them. Oftentimes the context in which you find the word helps you to recognize it, right? Depth is richness of word knowledge. You truly understand the relationships. You understand the multi-dimensions. You own these words, right? And these are words that you can easily use expressively. And fluency has everything access. And oftentimes we just think of fluency as it relates to the reading of a particular passage, but we can talk about the automaticity, access that we have for all these different levels of language processing, including vocabulary. And of course, as we have more and more experience with a word, we more easily access it. And if we don't want to take up too much of memory space for word meaning, it's an important thing to have in place as we deal with the complexity of comprehension, because it is quite complex to work through a text and work with all the different language and processes that go into the making of meaning. So once more, when we think about this multidimensional aspect of a word, all right, we want to be thinking about the fact that we know the phonology, the orthography, and the word. And that has some implication for our instruction if and we're working toward we're working toward our students having a deep knowledge of those words they choose to directly and systematically teach. It also means they have an understanding of morphology, semantic category, figurative use, syntactic category, and connotation. And so whether we're reading something like Tuck Everlasting, and we're talking about the word infinite or immortal, right? Or we're reading the founding of an American democracy, and we're thinking about words such as compromise or others. If we know that word deeply, then we know all of this about that particular word. So you might be asking what else should we be thinking about in terms of this? And I think Kate Nation has given us a bit of a clue here. She's told us that we need to be thinking about words kind of fitting into many interlocking systems and levels, that there are particular things to know about words, many degrees of knowing. And Merriam-Wolf, when you know a word, you know lots. So I'm just wondering now, if we were to go back to the Jamboard sticky notes, which we're not going to do, we'll use our keyboard right now. What else would you want to add to this thought about what vocabulary is and thinking about vocabulary from the perspective of how we acquire it? And I'll check in now on the chat. And I know Cammie's been looking at that as well to see perhaps if there are any questions that we need to respond to, but also right now, what words would you want to add to your Jamboard sticky notes? Let's put that in the chat. And perhaps, Cammie, you can tell me what you see popping up there.
So far we have multidimensional, foundational, interlocking system, meaning, receptive and expressive,
Cool.
multifaceted, conveys emotions.
Yes, that's the connotation. Yeah.
Yes. Depth, breadth and depth and fluency.
Perfect. Okay. All right. All right. Thank you, everyone, for contributing. All right. And let's then now begin to think about what I know you all probably signed on for, but so important that we always have an understanding of this foundational knowledge, the background knowledge, all right, the why of why we do things. But now, what are the components of an informed instructional framework? Okay. And so now let's be thinking a little bit about this. Oh, before I go any further, were there any questions, Cammie, that I need to respond to or comments?
Bev has a question. Let's see if I can find it.
I can just say it if it's okay, Cammie.
Sure, that's wonderful.
Okay. Yeah, I just had a question, Dr. Hennessy, about working memory and fluency. I mean, I know I'm old and my working memory is not as good as it used to be, so my vocabulary is not as fluent, but kids who have working memory problems, they might know the word, but they just have a lot of trouble retrieving it. So I just had a question about that,
Yeah, I think one of the things that we need to be thinking about with that is giving them opportunity to practice. And so in a moment, I'm going to talk about these multiple opportunities for practicing and processing word meaning that then should facilitate their access to word. Simply hearing the word one or two times, its definition one or two times is not going to be sufficient for those students. And so I listened to, it's interesting, I listened to a webinar the other day that Anita Archer did, and that whole issue of practice came up, and it really, I think, to this particular topic. Okay, all right. So we're back at the blueprint, aren't we? And so now we're going to think a little bit about an informed instructional framework and how that might support our vocabulary instruction. And if you note under text reading here, we have a series of questions that we're going to delve into in terms of vocabulary instruction. So this is an informed instructional framework that's based off of what the researchers, what the experts have told us about approaching vocabulary instruction. And it also reflects the questions, and you'll see those questions in a moment in a little more detail. When we begin to think about a framework for vocabulary instruction, we have to think about it from a four-pronged approach. This is not my idea. It comes directly out of the literature, all right? We need to be thinking about intentional instruction, so direct, explicit instruction. So words that we're going to choose from our text, or words that are provided to us through our curriculum. Sometimes we even need to modify that just a little bit based on our own knowledge base of our students and what it is that the understanding of what they're reading. Intentional instruction that's based on principles of instruction. Instructional routines then are rooted, based in those principles and the evidence, and then the opportunity for processing and practice. We also need to be thinking about incidental on purpose instruction, ways that we can give our students more access experiences with words, intentional independent learning strategies. Well, we won't be there all the time to directly instruct, and we can't directly instruct all the words that our students come across. So we have to give them tools, and the tools that we can give them certainly include using the dictionary, but someone mentioned context clues, and then using morphemic analysis. These are ways of unlocking meaning that our students can use independently. And then sort of foundational is word consciousness, and through purposeful activities, conveying the message that words are important. They're the building blocks of meaning, both for reading and for writing. And so engaging in activity that demonstrates the importance of words, but the fun we can have with words as well. So a four-pronged approach. We're going to focus just on intentional with a little bit on each of the others for the next few moments. All right. So what are those questions that the framework is based on? Well, how do you choose words for direct, intentional, on purpose, and indirect, incidental, on purpose vocabulary instruction, right? Because while we're going to directly teach words, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we need to give our students as many opportunities. We need to surround them with word meaning, with language. We have to ask ourselves about a consistent routine. So we need a routine, a simple routine initially for introducing the words, and then a more complex routine for providing the processing and practicing. So what activities do you typically use for processing word meaning? So considerations then listed on the left here in the highlighted box here, right? And then questions that we can be continually asking ourselves in terms of the design and delivery of instruction. Now, choosing words. Well, this is an interesting question, isn't it? Sometimes, as I said, the words are chosen for us, right? And then it's important that we be thinking about, are these the words that are necessary for our students to make meaning the text at hand, right? Do we need to use those words and perhaps supplement or modify based on our students, based on what it is that they're reading? And we use criteria to help us do that. We use criteria. Some of you may use Isabel Beck's tiers. Some of you may be familiar with Andy B. Miller's Wordsworth teaching, and so on. The three criteria that I have listed here are similar and commonly used. One, are the words useful and important? Does the word provide accessibility to the text? Is it a general purpose word that will be encountered in academic setting that our students are going to see over and over again? Does it have enduring importance? Secondly, understanding. Is it critical to the understanding of the varied levels of the text? And by varied levels, I mean literal as well as inferential understanding. Because sometimes a word will not be in our text, right? If it's a big idea kind of word, like democracy, right? Sometimes it won't be there, but the reading is all about. So we have to be cognizant of that. And then growth. Does the word support growing or generating word learning? Is it part of a morphological family? We can build on it. Does it have semantic relatives? Does it have multiple meanings, right? This is called a fuzzy problem space, not my words, someone else's. Whose? I read it somewhere, but what it conveys is perfect formula for this, all right? But there are guidelines that we can follow, and I've just provided them for you. All right, what about the choice of words? Well, here's just an example. Some of you may use this text, Tuck Everlasting. I could have chosen an informational text, such as the founding of American democracy, or the one that I mentioned earlier about climate change, climate warming. But again, thinking through using the criteria for this particular selection, Tuck Everlasting, what words might I choose for intentional, direct, explicit teaching, right? And you see them there. What words would I think about incidentally? Now, by incidental, I mean that as we're reading, we can provide point of contact, just slip in a synonym or a substitution, all right? Or we can use them in oral conversation as we prep and get ready to read, or after we read, right? And you see some of them there. And then what words, based on the text at hand, remember I mentioned something about contextualized instruction before, all right, might I choose to practice using context clues that I've directly explicitly taught, right? Or the use of morphemes, right? I've directly explicitly taught my students how to work with morphemes and the meanings of morphemes. Okay, so I like to save time. I think we all know that that's a precious commodity. And so if we think about our text from these multiple perspectives, we're ready to provide opportunity for the development of breadth as well as depth. All right. Then what about the instructional routine? All right. What about these principles of instruction that I was just talking about? All right. What does the literature tell us about this? How do we go about actually teaching words directly and systematically? Well, this is Stephen Stahl's work. It certainly has been validated by many others. The first and foremost thought that needs to come to mind is we need to provide our students with definitional and contextual information. I would not suggest that you ask them for the definition. I would suggest that you provide the definition to them, right? And then in terms of a more complex routine, right, because we want to develop these words that we're intentionally teaching, we want more processing and practice. We want to give them multiple exposures, engagement in deep processing, multiple activities. Right? We're not doing that for every single word, but we're doing it for those words that our curriculum has identified, or those words that we consider, that we've chosen, that we consider critical to the understanding of the text. So let's just think through this routine, which is both simple and complex in nature. Let's just think through it for a moment. All right. So if I, in fact, all right, need to provide definitional and contextual information to my students, how might I do that for the words that I've selected? And this word happens to be the word disaster. Okay. This is from Tuck Everlasting. Right. It is a word that I identified in that very first column for intentional instruction. And as I think through how to go about providing a definition to my students, I can think about it from this perspective. For nouns, right, I want to provide the category the word falls in, and then I want to talk about the features of the word, right? So this is a word meaning map. These are even maps that we can use with our students eventually for them representing meaning of word. So what is it? Disaster, it's an event. What's its features? It happens suddenly, it causes harm, great unhappiness, and loss. Now, remember I said you needed contextual information as well. So what's the context for this particular word in Tuck Everlasting? Well, I'm going to go directly to my text. Now, I know sometimes we provide a context or we ask our students for context, but when we're working within a particular reading, let's go there first, all right? So the discovery of a spring would be an immense disaster. Right? The pebbles hid the spring in an attempt to avoid a disaster. A disaster brings major problems. Now I can lift those sentences directly from the text, or I can coin sentences that relate directly to the text, and that's what I've done here. All right, I'm going to skip this next activity because I can see that we're running a little low on time. This usually happens, all right? But this was a Padlet activity. And just very quickly, so that you have a sense of a word meaning map for an adjective, all right? Generally, if it's an adjective, we have to think about what does it describe and then what words are similar. And of course, exhausted is feeling. And what words are similar? Well, you can think of some. Probably you have felt these last school year and perhaps even the beginning of this new one. All right, very tired, worn out, pooped, and so on. Okay. Once we have developed that definitional and contextual information, once we have the language to convey to our students, then we use a simple routine in which we introduce the word to our students. So I'm going to just briefly ask you to think about, there's a teacher behavior column here. This is what I would be doing or you would be doing. There's a student behavior column. We need to teach our students what we expect their response to be. And then I've just given you critical connections because remember, I said something about the fact that when you really know a word, you know its phonology, its orthography, its syntax, its semantics, and so on. All right, be my students. Ready? I'm going to work through the teacher behavior side here, all right? And then I'm just going to ask you to be thinking about the student behavior. So our word for today, for instance, if it would be the word disaster, I would pronounce the word. So students, we're going to learn about the word disaster today. You'd be listening to me, all right? You'd pronounce, I would pronounce that targeted word, and then I would ask you to repeat. So everybody just repeat disaster, right? You can just mute yourself. You don't need to say it out loud or just say it to yourself, right? Then I'd ask you to think a little bit about the linguistic structure, because when we know a word well, we not only know its meaning, we didn't even get there yet, right? We know its phonology, orthography, and so on. So we'll just listen for a moment and think a little bit about, all right, that word is disaster. How many syllables in that word? Oh, disaster. 3. I hear 3 syllables. Now, I might even say to you, do you know what part of speech that word is? Or do you know what question? Because I like to think about the function of a word, not so much its form. All right. Do you know what question that word disaster would respond or answer? Oh, the what? All right. Because a noun can describe a what. And then I would explain it in the words that I just used from the word meaning map. And you'd be listening. And I would provide example. And then I would ask you for some examples if you had some of the word disaster. And then I would say the word again, and I would say, listen as I spell and watch as I write it on my whiteboard. And then I want you to repeat and write as well. And now what am I focused on? The orthography, the spelling of the word. Okay, that's the simple routine. Took a few minutes, but it really doesn't take all that long when you're actually doing this and you're doing it in a very systematic way with your students. All right. The second part of the routine had everything to do with practice. All right. The processing and practice piece. And so here it has to do with providing multiple exposures, distributed practice. All right. For students, time after as well as time a week from now and maybe even later. Engagement in deep processing so that they can think about this relationship to other words, to themes, and so on. So I have categorized the ways of processing and practice, again, based on what the evidence tells us is meaningful, right? So we can make connections. We make connections semantically. Remember, those semantic relationships are important, that interrelatedness of word. And we can do that by having our students, and of course we don't do all of these things, but having our students construct semantic maps or do semantic feature analysis or concept maps. We also know that representations support understanding. So pictures, drawings, videos, even gestures and movements and word walls. And then we come to use, where we talked before about this wanting to develop the ability to express understanding orally and in writing So asking questions, providing examples, conversation prompts, writing stems. All right. Now, this is a lot to look at. I want you to know it's in your participation guide, so you can take some time to look at it at another point in time. But I wanted you to have kind of this instructional roadmap that represents the fact that I'm just talking about a few ways of doing this. There are many ways of choosing words, of representing definition, and then of connecting, representing, and using. And I've just provided some examples for you. You probably could fill in some additional squares here with other examples, but I'm just going to share now some specific examples from the columns here to the right, the connect, the represent, and the use. So if I'm connecting, all right, I might use shades of meaning. Those a little bit look a little bit like those paint strips, don't they? The paint samples we get from the paint store. All right, there's a difference between being tired, sleepy, and exhausted. Grades of meaning, a scaling of meaning, right? And talking through what is the difference? Tired, sleepy, pooped, burned out, exhausted, putting it on a line, right? Asking students what's here, what goes here, and why, right? And even providing them with the words and having them do the arrangement, okay? So a scaling. Thinking about synonyms versus antonyms, being tired versus being rested. We also, in a very basic way, can talk about the attributes of a particular word. The word spring was one of the words that I focused on. And of course, spring can be both a noun or a verb. In this case, all right, the spring was the noun, all right? Finding that spring was a disaster, right? We can begin by thinking about attributes of a particular word in a very simple way, moving from left to right. Very basic: color, size, shape, number. Then smells, taste, texture, sounds like, and your feelings. Then made of, age, design. And thinking about how that might apply to this description of the spring. This, by the way, is the work of Charlie Haynes and Terrell Jennings, and their wonderful book that has to do with from talking to writing, right? All right, so we can connect then through semantic maps, scaling, attributes. How about representation? All right, let's take a quick look. Well, of course, many of you have your students draw. Perhaps you have them find Google image that can represent. This happens to be a few words again from Tuck Everlasting. What's it mean to be isolated? What's it mean to conceal? And yeah, this young fellow is a bit gifted in terms of drawing, and not all our students would be, but they don't have to be to represent visually with a drawing or with a Google image. Word wall was also under that column of represent, and that probably seemed like a different one to you, because oftentimes, you know, our word walls serve different purposes. Well, why not take your words and have them arranged based on part of speech? Why do we teach part of speech as part of a definition? Why do we find it in the dictionary, for instance? All right, because part of speech conveys the kinds of questions that particular word can answer. It conveys its function within a sentence. So a noun answers the question who or what. Can we arrange all our words that are nouns? Right? Verbs are the doing words, is or was doing. Which words are the is or was doing words? Which words are the which, one, what, kind, how many? Which words are the when, why, and how? Right? So thinking a bit through, and sometimes words can represent more than one function, and we know that as well. Spring, for instance. Okay. And then the third column again, the use. All right. So speaking, all right, getting our students to talk about the words, to use the language. And this, of course, is based on some of the work of Beck and McCune. So you've seen something similar to this. If I say something that could describe feeling isolated, then raise your hand, right? And then you would give a description. Applaud how much you would want to feel exhausted or energetic. Describe a time when you had to conceal something. Or why would someone be exhausted? Or when I feel isolated, I feel. Or how are these words related? Discontent, isolated, conceal. All words coming from tuck, everlasting. All right. And then use in writing. Here come your writing stems. Winnie, who's a major character, feels discontented because if I were immortal, May's exhaustion, May, another character, is the result of. And concealing the spring was important because. So embedding those vocab words within the context of a sentence stem, giving your students opportunity to use them expressively. So again, here's the entire roadmap, all right? Word choice definition, different ways to think about this, and then different ways to think about connect, represent, or use, right? And again, I'm quite certain that many of you would be able to add to this. Okay. So in the remaining minutes, I was going to talk just briefly about incidental on purpose and intentional independent. And I'm just going to do that quickly, and then we'll see if we can't respond to anything that's in the chat. So let me just move on very quickly. Incidentally, on purpose, we can use structured point of contact teaching. In other words, you're providing a substitute or a synonym as you read or prior to or after. But also included here is the importance of having structured teacher-student talk. You have to have a talking classroom for students to acquire these words, for them to slow map. You need to give them a reason for reading, structured shared reading. Let's listen for the interesting words. What words did you find interesting or intriguing? Same thing for structured independent reading. Most of students' knowledge of word meaning after they can read independently is going to come through their independent reading. Again, we can't teach them all of the words. And then we've already mentioned the importance of dictionary, but also context clues and morphemic analysis. We need to directly, explicitly teach them how do we use a context clues? What are context clues? And what are the morphemes that we're going to encounter within our reading? And how do we take words apart to infer? In both instances, you're inferring word meaning using context clues and morphemic analysis. So one of the resources I wanted to point out to you was Teachable Moments, the Arc of Vocabulary. Judy Dotson, a colleague of mine, speaking about the importance of integrating language development into everyday activity and the use of rich and positive talk throughout the day. We know that this is important for our students, our written language based on our oral language foundations. And then also thinking about the fact that our students are not always going to be able to have us available, so we have to give them those tools to unlock meaning, and those would be dictionary, context, and morphology. And that I intentionally, when I developed those words for both intentional and incidental and intentional word learning strategies, I identified those words from the text itself up front. And then these are just two examples. Not all words created equal. You can't always use context clues for everything, but here's two, all right, reflection and continuously, that the clues were right there within the sentence for the student and then assisted them in understanding what the meaning of reflection and continuously was. Here's an additional resource for those of you working with students, EL students. All that I've said here applies, but in addition, thinking about making the connections across languages, providing instruction on cognates, promoting native language vocabulary learning, and so on. Okay, so I think we've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. Cami, in the chat, is there anything that we need to attend to right now?
We do have a couple of questions. Someone back where you were talking about the word walls, they said, what do you mean by features in word maps cell?
What do I mean by features in word maps? I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Lisa, would you like to elaborate?
Sure.
Yeah, on the blue page that's got word choice definition, connect, represent, blah, blah, blah. The second line, the second cell is word maps, and it says word category features examples.
Oh, so that had to do with the word meaning map that I showed you an example of, in which you begin to think a little bit about, if it's a noun, for instance, you think about the category the word falls into, then what its features are, and then some examples you would pull from context.
So
Okay.
what is a feature?
The feature, well, for instance, a feature in the word disaster, that would be an event. A feature would be it happens quickly, it causes unhappiness. That's what a feature would be. Okay, a result of, or something that connects to it. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right.
And Nancy, we're actually scheduled to 4:45, so we have plenty of time left. We do have a couple more questions. It says, if I wanted to incorporate vocabulary into my daily 5 routine, what would it be appropriate to incorporate this into my word work activities, or should vocabulary be taught through direct instruction? And they say I have 3rd graders.
Okay. So I'm not as familiar with the Daily 5 as you are. I remember reading about it a while ago, but I haven't gone back and revisited. But if your word work has to do with the ability to read word, to work with word from the perspective of word recognition, yes, you could work vocabulary in at that particular point, but then you also have to connect the meaning of, obviously, and provide a context for it. So hopefully that answered the question. I tend to think about, just so you know, I tend to think about vocabulary work being done within the context of whatever it is that we're asking our students to read. And I often, I know we can do this within decodable and level text, but I really feel we should be using age and grade appropriate text with our students to develop those competencies that are necessary for deep comprehension. And sometimes that means you're reading to them. Oftentimes with that reading rope, what happens is we're very focused on the lower strands of the rope, and we're not attending at the same time with our younger children to the upper strands of the rope, and we should be through our read alouds, reading to them, having them listen by ear.
Okay, we have another question, and someone's wanting to know if you can recommend any screeners for vocabulary.
Oh, I haven't revisited all of the latest updates on the screeners, but I know that the predictive assessment of reading, the PAR, which was developed a while back, did have a screener contained within it for vocabulary. I don't know if anyone else is familiar, and certainly share if you are. Okay.
We've gotten just a lot of comments other than that. This one says, do you have suggestions for vocabulary instruction and maps for younger elementary students?
So are you asking for a resource? Is that what you're asking for? I'm not certain.
Yes.
So again, because I take the approach that we work within the text that we're working with, I don't necessarily think about something in addition to, other than some of the resource materials that are available to teachers that can help them, fine tune their instruction. I'm just looking to see if I had included, sometimes I include some additional resources. Yeah, here, these are some of the additional resources that I tend to think about for teachers to help them refine instruction. So as we're talking on the slide before that I've just moved from, at the very beginning, I asked you to think about affirmations, acknowledgements, or actions. So if you want to put in the chat any affirmation, something that made you feel like, wow, pat yourself on the back here, doing a good job, or acknowledgements, thinking, maybe I should think a little bit more about that, and that would lead me to take this action. So why don't we just take these last few moments to enter that into the chat.
There is a question if you could provide the name of that vocabulary assessment you just mentioned again.
Sure, the predictive assessment of reading. Predictive assessment of reading.
Thank you.
PAR. Okay. Anyone else? Any acknowledgements, affirmations, actions? Oh, someone said that I can see, just quickly looking at this, they began letters training. Yes, I'm a letters trainer, and yes, it should align. You know, if we're following the science of reading, even though we express these things in different ways, may have some different ideas, we should be aligning with one another.
Yeah, Nancy, I just wanted to say there's a lot of amens in here and a lot of, yeah, this is great for ELs, and I wish I were still in the classroom, I would be doing this, and yeah, lots of affirmations.
That's great. Okay, good. That's what we want. We want to be encouraging. We want to honor what everyone's doing, recognize this is a difficult job being a teacher. But we always need to be thinking about what else can we be doing? What else should we be learning? Just like our students, we have to be learners. Right. Any other questions?
It's just a lot of really good comments.
Yes. A lot of people saying thank you, and that it was wonderful and absolutely fabulous.
Right. All right. Well, thank you, Bev. I appreciated the invitation. Thank you, Cammie. With the Department of Education. This was really an honor for me as well. I love acting with educators.
And an honor for us as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, everybody.
And we did promote the book, right?
Well,
Blueprint.
That's fine. I mean, if you're interested, you know, it's not all about the book, but that's the book. Let's see, the Reading Comprehension Blueprint, and it's Brooks Publishing. But yes, everything I shared with you today is in the book.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Maybe a little bit more. And I know that there's not much spare time for reading, so not to worry. Okay. All right. Take care, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thanks, Cammie, for the support. I appreciated it.
My pleasure. Yes.
All right. Bye, Bev.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.